UF throughout history, armies have spent enormous amounts of money trying to build better weapons. Most of those weapons looked exactly as you would expect, some did not. These are machines so strange that they seem less like military equipment and more like engineering experiments that somehow escaped into reality. From armored steel spheres with no known purpose to tanks built from farm equipment, these are some of the weirdest military vehicles ever created. Kugelpanzer. Nobody knows what it was for. That is not an exaggeration or a rhetorical device. Military historians, weapons analysts, and armored vehicle engineers have studied the single surviving example for decades and have not reached a consensus on what tactical purpose the Kugelpanzer was designed to serve. It is a steel ball approximately 5 feet in diameter, mounted on a single rear wheel and 2 small front struts, powered by a 1-cylinder motorcycle engine with a narrow viewport at the front and enough interior space for one person sitting in extreme discomfort. Germany sent it to Japan during the Second World War as part of a technology exchange program. The Soviet Union captured it in Manchuria in 1945 and transferred it to the Kugelpanzer Tank Museum outside Moscow, where it has sat ever since. The armor is 8mm thick, sufficient to stop small arms fire at range and nothing else. The top speed is estimated at 5 miles per hour. The single example in existence has never been tested, never been fired at, and never been explained. The documents describing its purpose were either destroyed or never existed. What remains is a steel ball in a museum that everyone who sees it immediately wants explained. And the honest answer is that nobody alive today can provide one. It is the only weapon in history whose entire file has been lost to time, leaving behind nothing but the object itself and the question it refuses to answer. And strangely enough, nobody knowing what it was for does not make it the strangest machine on this list. Because the next vehicle was built for a purpose everyone understood. That purpose simply happened to be a terrible idea. Semple Tank. The Semple Tank was built in New Zealand in 1940 by the Minister of Works Bob Semple during a period when New Zealand had no tanks, no prospect of receiving tanks from Britain, and a genuine fear of Japanese invasion. Semple's solution was to take a Caterpillar D8 tractor, a machine designed to move earth rather than fight wars, weld corrugated iron sheeting around it, cut holes in the sheeting for 6 Bren guns operated by crew members lying on mattresses inside, and declare the result a tank. It weighed 25 tons. The corrugated iron that protected its crew was the same material used to build farm sheds across rural New Zealand, and it offered approximately the same degree of ballistic protection. The crew of 8 operated in conditions that combined the mechanical environment of a bulldozer with the tactical environment of a pillbox and the comfort of neither. Military reviews were not favorable. The New Zealand Army declined to adopt it for operational use. Bob Semple defended his creation until the end of his life, arguing that something was better than nothing, and that the critics had not been the ones facing the prospect of an invasion with no armor at all. He was not entirely wrong. The tank was simply entirely wrong. What it represented, stripped of the corrugated iron and the military pretension, was the desperation of a small nation at the edge of a war. It had no resources to fight properly, and a minister who refused to let that desperation be the last word. If desperation can create unusual vehicles, innovation can too. The next machine attempted to solve a real battlefield problem in a way no conventional tank ever had. Praying Mantis Tank. The Praying Mantis was a British experimental vehicle developed during the Second World War to solve a specific problem. How does an armored vehicle engage an enemy position behind a wall, a riverbank, or any raised obstacle without exposing itself to return fire? The answer the designers arrived at was a tank with a hydraulically elevating fighting compartment. A 2-man turret mounted on a scissor mechanism that could raise the gunners above the obstacle, allow them to fire, and lower them back behind cover before the enemy could respond. The vehicle itself remained behind the obstacle throughout the engagement. Only the fighting compartment appeared above it briefly, like the head of a praying mantis rising above grass to strike at something and retreating before the prey could respond. In testing, it worked. The crew could engage targets from cover that a conventional tank could not use at all. What it could not do was move quickly, operate on uneven terrain, or survive any direct engagement with a vehicle that did not need to hide behind walls to function. The British Army evaluated it, acknowledged the ingenuity of the concept, and declined to proceed. The Praying Mantis was a solution to a real problem that created more problems than it solved. A machine that worked perfectly within the narrow conditions it was designed for and failed everywhere else. Some experimental vehicles tried to solve problems with clever engineering. Others solved them with brute force simplicity. Porcupine Tank. The Porcupine Tank was a Soviet experimental vehicle that took the fundamental question of armored warfare, how do you protect a tank from infantry attacks at close range, and answered it with a mechanism so literal it seems almost satirical. Standard tanks were vulnerable to infantry soldiers approaching from the sides and rear where the main gun could not traverse to engage them. The Porcupine's designers fitted the hull with retractable spikes, hardened steel projections that could be deployed outward from the tank's surface to prevent infantry from approaching closely enough to attach magnetic mines or place charges against the armor. The spikes gave the vehicle its name and its appearance, which was somewhere between a medieval weapon and an animal cornered by predators. The concept was tested and the results were mixed. The spikes were effective at keeping infantry at a distance, but added weight, created snagging hazards in terrain and vegetation, and addressed a problem that better crew training and combined arms tactics solved more elegantly, and at considerably lower cost. The Porcupine Tank was cancelled, and the spikes were retracted permanently, leaving behind a vehicle that remains the only tank in history that attempted to solve a tactical problem by becoming, in the most literal sense possible, impossible to touch. And then there were engineers who looked at the limitations of tanks and decided the problem was not the tank itself. The problem was that it couldn't fly. Flying tank. The Antonov A-40 was the Soviet Union's attempt to give a tank the ability to appear anywhere, not by driving it there, not by shipping it there, but by flying it there and gliding it to the ground while the crew sat inside. A T-60 light tank was fitted with a biplane glider assembly, detachable wings, and a tail unit that would allow it to be towed aloft by a heavy bomber, released over a target area, and glided to a landing by the tank's driver, who would then detach the glider assembly and drive away into battle as if nothing unusual had occurred. It flew once in 1942, towed by a Tupolev TB-3 bomber that found the combination so aerodynamically compromised that it was forced to release the glider prematurely. The tank glider descended, landed successfully, and the driver detached the wings and drove away. A moment that must have felt like the future of warfare arriving all at once. The future did not stay. The T-60 was too heavy for practical towing by any available bomber without severely limiting the towing aircraft's own range and payload. The program was cancelled after that single flight, leaving behind the image of a tank with wings as the most unlikely successful experiment in the history of armored warfare. A machine that worked exactly once and was never given the chance to work again. As improbable as a flying tank sounds, the next machine was never intended for war at all, yet it would become one of the most infamous armored vehicles ever created. Killdozer. On June 4, 2004, a man named Marvin Heemeyer in Granby, Colorado, drove a heavily modified Komatsu D355A bulldozer through 13 buildings in his town over the course of 2 hours before the machine became stuck in a basement and he took his own life. The modifications he had spent 18 months making in secret were extraordinary. Half-inch steel plate welded over the entire machine. Concrete poured between the outer and inner steel layers for additional protection. Cameras mounted externally and connected to monitors inside so he could see while sealed within his armored shell. And gun ports cut into the steel in case he needed to fire outward. The result weighed approximately 85 tons and was effectively impervious to everything law enforcement attempted: bullets, explosives, a spike strip. During the 2 hours it moved through Granby. The machine was never formally a tank, never built by an army, and never intended for military use. It was built by one man with a grievance against his town in a garage using construction equipment and commercially available steel. The fact that it outperformed many purpose-built armored vehicles in its resistance to attack is either a tribute to Heemeyer's engineering or a sobering observation about what a determined person with basic materials and 18 months of uninterrupted work can build when the people around them are not paying attention. Military engineers are not the only people capable of building extraordinary machines. But the next vehicle was designed for a battlefield far more extreme than anything seen before. Object 279. The Object 279 looks like something designed by a person who had heard tanks described but never seen one. Built by the Soviet Union in 1959, it has 4 tracks instead of 2 on each side running parallel, spread wide beneath a hull shaped like a flying saucer, flattened and elliptical, intended to deflect incoming shells by presenting no flat surface for them to strike directly. The 4-track configuration distributed the vehicle's 60-ton weight across a wider footprint than any conventional tank, allowing it to operate on ground too soft or too waterlogged for standard tracked vehicles to cross. It was designed specifically for a nuclear battlefield. The wide tracks would allow it to move through the cratered, destabilized terrain that nuclear detonations would create, and the elliptical hull shape was calculated to resist the overpressure waves that followed those detonations. The 4 tracks, the flying saucer hull, the nuclear battlefield specification. Each decision made in isolation was defensible. Together, they produced a vehicle that looked like nothing else in the history of warfare and moved like nothing that was ever expected to fight alongside conventional armor. Nikita Khrushchev canceled it in 1960, ruling that Soviet armor should be lighter and more mobile. The single prototype survives at the Kugelpanzer Tank Museum, looking as extraordinary today as the day it was built. Most strange military machines were built because someone misunderstood a problem. The next machine was built because someone underestimated one: Panjandrum. The Panjandrum was a British weapon developed in 1943 for the specific purpose of destroying the concrete obstacles defending German-held beaches ahead of the D-Day landings. The concept was 2 large wooden wheels, each 9 feet in diameter, connected by a central axle packed with 70 pounds of explosives. Cordite rockets attached to the outer rim of each wheel would ignite simultaneously, propelling the device up the beach at speed toward the obstacles where the explosives would detonate on impact. In testing on a British beach in January 1944, with senior military observers and newsreel cameras present, the Panjandrum entered the water, began moving toward the beach under rocket power, and immediately demonstrated that rockets attached to the outside of rolling wheels do not ignite evenly, do not burn consistently, and do not propel a device in any predetermined direction. Rockets detached and fired randomly across the beach. The Panjandrum veered left, turned back toward the sea, turned again, shed more rockets, and eventually came to rest harmlessly in the surf while the observers scattered across the sand. The footage of the test, including the newsreel cameraman running for his life as a rocket-propelled wooden wheel pursued him across the beach, survived and has been viewed millions of times. The Panjandrum was immediately canceled. The beaches were cleared by other means, and the film remained as evidence of what happens when a weapon is designed by people who have never watched. Rockets burn unevenly on a wet beach in January, and yet, as absurd as these machines appear today, every one of them was built by serious engineers attempting to solve serious problems. Some failed because the technology did not exist. Some failed because the idea itself was flawed, and a few succeeded just enough to prove that the impossible was not entirely impossible. The history of military engineering is often told through its greatest successes, but its strangest failures can be just as revealing. Because every bizarre machine on this list represents a moment when someone looked at an impossible problem and decided that the conventional answer was not good enough. Sometimes they changed history. Most of the time they created something unforgettable, and in many cases, that was enough.